this is the 7th update I've done in relation to the Hydaelyn Zodiac Grand Project. And yeah, holy crap. So the last time I gave you guys an update was October 9th, 2024. So it's been a year since I gave you guys an update. Like, God. But I think if I can get back into that headspace a year ago, that was when I was doing 3 to 4 months per update video, where I was in this comfy mode of like finishing a major segment and then giving you guys an update. But of course, with Stormblood, I was forced to give several updates due to the several absurdities that I had to overcome in that time. And largely, the stubbornness in refusing to give an update on Shadowbringers was this silly notion that I was going to do only one update per major expansion, which now, looking back on the last year, was an entirely silly justification. Okay, so the writing for Shadowbringers analysis is done, and let me tell you, where do I even begin with the update? So, okay, so I want to predominantly give you a play-by-play of what was happening during the rewrite. In other words, every section of the writing I was focusing on, what the mechanical stuff I was doing at that time. This just means going through things like playing FF14's content, recording videos, editing videos, grabbing resources, and what sort of philosophical challenges I was under during that time. As once the video comes out, you will see a variety of influences. Okay, so to begin, the original Shadowbringer script was around 60,000 words and 5 to 10,000 on notes and video descriptions. We have around 50,000 words in total. The final count per this updated writing, which might increase or decrease, is 172,000 words, which will be around 20 or 30,000 words on notes and descriptions, which will put us around 140,000 words. In as much, the experience around the end of 2024, when I finished the Stormblood analysis section, was a little bit of a hopeful optimism because, as stated multiple times on the initial round of the writing, the original Shadowbringer script was when I believed I found my voice. In other words, I became more confident in what I wanted to write and the direction I wanted the analysis to go down. In addition, philosophically, I was going through a form of metamorphosis at that time where I was getting closer to finishing Satra. Okay, so speaking of Satra, let's rewind the tape here on my philosophical journey. Originally, I was not going to read Being a Nothingness. And you can already see my initial mentality with philosophy here, where I was merely going to use philosophy as a secondary support by reading the easy to understand stuff like Stoicism, scientific books, the easier books in Buddhism, and basically stuff you can interpret as the type of philosophy that can be read as self-help. Camus springs to mind here, right? So that's not to say that any of these philosophies are bad or whatever. It's just that compared to what I know now, it's a bit of a great difference, let's just say. Right, so I don't say this to like mock on any of these subjects that I bring up, but there's a great shift in my mind when I finally entered something like Being in Nothingness, where Sartre really he's really carrying an entire history of continental philosophy and that type of thinking in this book. Insofar as there was this, so what was happening during then, after the Stormblood analysis, was that there was this intellectual ego within me that went, it's like, can I really say, we tried our best here if we did not read the core existential text? Can I really admit I gave it my best shot by actively avoiding the hard stuff? And by already being, in the door with many philosophical traditions, I chose to take the dive into Being a Nothingness. In this case, I was also watching, let me open this up. John Vervaeke's 50-episode lecture series, which, in my opinion, is a little flawed in some technical ways, but worth a watch if you're curious about existential ideas. Vervaeke highly values Heidegger's being in time and can almost be seen as a neo-Heideggerian cognitive scientist. Sartre also talks about Heidegger. Um, um, what was the point here? Like, many philosophers note wrongly about him. Right. Sartre's reading of, I remember now, reading of Heidegger was largely dictated by a very questionable French translation. One of the first French translations of Heidegger's magnum opus. And of course, it is impossible to engage with existentialism without Heidegger getting mentioned. So remember this. So I was a little bit, just a little bit naively optimistic when I finished the Stormblood analysis. I mentioned this during the last update video as well. I was unclear on what will happen to happen with Shadowbringer, the Shadowbringers rewrite, as with the previous sections, it was a write-up from the ground up, and this made the process more streamlined. And I felt like it was easier when I went through it multiple times, that process. For Shadowbringers, the foundational text structure and ideas had to remain, but what needed to happen was fully reworking the ideas of the work I had done in the previous sections into the Shadowbringers rewrite. Not only this, of course, while I was rewriting everything else, I had ideas in Shadowbringers that I wanted to explore, of things like, oh, this part would be better if I did this, or oh, if I mentioned this work here, this will reinforce my argument. In this case, when I was brainstorming the rewrite, it seemed deceptively simple because the goal wasn't to build from the ground up, but about buffering all the arguments. Therefore, the first couple of months after October 2024 was more on doing more of the mechanical side of the work while I was in the depths of being a nothingness. Of course, when I say mechanical, what is meant is my ever accursed relationship with timestamping my playthroughs so that I can mark which clips to use along with my argument. The timestamping that I always do serves as the primer of understanding the story both in its themes and format on the rewatch of my playthroughs, which I accept now as a core part of my method, even though I will always do it kicking and screaming. In doing so, I can probably analyze the skeleton of my original Shadowbringers notes and synthesize the ideas in a structure brainstorm of adding the meat onto that framework. This is basically the first two steps you see here. Also, mechanically, several things were happening with grabbing the footage of certain key quests that I haven't played in the game. I was close to finishing all the pre-Dawntrail job quests, leveling them all to 100 and whatnot. And I needed to play the story all the way to the end of 6.5 while I was just on 6.3, patch 6.3 before. I needed to play through every single dungeon using duty support, as this removes the awkwardness of having other people in the video while also injecting a bit of narrative nuance with the actual story characters' reactions in the dungeons. And of course, opening up access to every key post-Endwalker quest, including these quest chains, which is Margaret's custom delivery, Tataru's grand endeavor, and a heartless hypothesis. We'll get to the other quests you see on this list later. Again, not only does this involve merely playing through the content, recording it, and also editing the video, cutting the fluff, cataloging these videos, making backups of it, and of course throwing them on a site where I have easy access to all this relevant content. We'll get back to the ironies of this in a second. Therefore, you will note why this process of work took around until the end of 2024. In this case, at the beginning of 2025, I was mostly finished with being in nothingness, while coming to an impasse on where I wanted to go on my philosophical journey. In this case, I read Albert Camus' The Rebel as a bit of a buffer. Furthermore, I believe the writing was going well with patch 5.0's rewrite. I think what will catch me off guard at the beginning of 2025 is that I was actually straight up rewriting and essentially reformatting my original writing from scratch, in which now that I realized what was happening, what I was actually only keeping the ideas of the original work while actively transforming the entire argument. This is an effect of reading too much philosophy, as one of the predominant side effects is seeing where your rhetoric succeeds or fails. So, one of the biggest reasons of doing this is, again, directing the entire flow of the writing and argumentation from ARR to Stormblood into Shadowbringer's writing. So, in other words, like tracing all the content and the ideas up to the Shadowbringers writing. Looking back, this total transformative process was a bit of a surprise to me, as when I started doing the part one that you see, I merely thought I was doing a bit of like, I thought I was just doing this like I was brushing up, not that it will determine the course of the Shadowbringers rewrite. In terms of writing, everything I mentioned became most notable around section 2 that you see here. Sorry. In other words, this is when you see what it means when Final Fantasy XIV is an epic story. If we trace the movement of A Realm Reborn Thancred, where it's like, haha, I'm a womanizer, alcoholic, and a workaholic, to Shadowbringer's Thancred of, I'm worthless, I hate my life, I'm not doing enough. The biggest part to the transformation to the writing was my relationship to the understanding of Minfilia's, like, her actual story. In the original Shadowbringer's writing, Minfilia's part is greatly glossed over. However, in the rewrite, having played through patch 1.0 and re-examining her character through her relationship with Thancred, the writing needed to reflect this new understanding. And the Minfilia example here is also one of the core goals of the writing, and the difference between what the writers wanted her story to be versus what it became in Final Fantasy XIV. To give a counterexample of this, what you see here in section 4 on villains in conflict is extremely, the writing is extremely smooth, as they are self-contained arguments on a narrative analysis itself. In other words, sections like this only needed like a slight touching up. So this back and forth, like rewriting, reformatting, and ultimately transforming patch 5.0's writing went on until March of 2025. Like, so no major complaints here, all going smoothly aside from my usual annoyance of not doing things faster. So around the beginning of March, Twitch sends out a warning email to all of its content creators. They were nuking their video section of their site. To be specific, they were essentially reducing the amount of video storage on Twitch to 100 hours. Anyone who plays video games and store video game footage on Twitch knows that that is essentially nothing. That's nothing. You might as well have no capacity. In short, cursing my own stupidity of laziness of just throwing everything on Twitch, I was screwed. However, this was compounded by the fact that my philosophical journey had finally been altered by John Vervaeke's 50-episode lecture series, insofar as the core point is I was finally convinced to read Heidegger's Being in Time. Originally, and this is actually fairly common, when understanding that Heidegger was indeed a Nazi, I do mean this literally, I did not want to engage with his works. Looking back, this was something extremely foolish and something I will greatly expand on in later videos. In this case, being in nothingness was already extremely difficult for me, as Asatra brought heavy baggage from difficult continental positions. Therefore, being in time might as well be a jump into the incomprehensible to me. Simply, this was like studying a new language, both linguistically and phenomenologically. Not only did I need to understand the language, but I needed to be able to employ it in the philosophical system to have mastery over the philosophy. To be clear, for someone not classically trained in philosophy, moving into being in time revealed all my flaws in my initial engagement with philosophy. And as such, this was what made it a nightmare to read. So to keep both things in mind then, the Twitch VOD apocalypse and the Herculean struggle with a specific philosophy warped my mentality to constant anxiety versus the initial optimism I started with in working with Shadowbringers. Okay, so in this case, the core question you might have is this: why did this completely halt the progress of the Shadowbringers rewrite? As such, the reality of the VOD apocalypse needs to be addressed, in as much the 30 to 40 days deadline before the Twitch system automatically deletes all of your videos needed to be urgently addressed by me. Using Twitch's system was out of the question. You see these video sizes? Okay, so I want you to imagine requesting over 100 different videos on Twitch over 20 hours, with each 20-hour plus video requests taking hours and hours to respond. In addition, using Twitch's browser download option, this will, ultimately clicking on that button will lead to the will it, won't it, finish tension of downloading something like a 20 or 30 gigabytes, which, after that I reviewed my writing, is actually more like something like requesting like a 100 gigabyte file from Twitch's servers, which is even more absurd. This isn't a fun game to play, trust me. So Twitch's function, okay, and advice to use its video uploading system directly to YouTube only works for highlights that are under 12 hours. In other words, what they failed to specify is the fact that uploaded videos cannot be uploaded to YouTube using this function. I must re-download all my VODs and re-upload them as such. To put it bluntly, I would have never made the video apocalypse deadline using purely Twitch's functions. Of course, this leads to the third-party tool with our salvation, in one being an open source Twitch downloader. While it is our savior, it operates specifically as an FFmpeg downloader, which you see there. Simply, it downloads off of 5-second video segments as a scan and download index and will catalog and complete the whole video as at its completion. Running multiple downloads is highly intensive on the CPU, the RAM, on the input and output of reading and copying data, and on my internet bandwidth. To expand on the absurdity, during this entire 2 to 3 week process, my streaming PC had about 5 different types of blue screen errors from simply being overwhelmed with the download output. Not to mention, I had to spend like $1,000 Canadian on external SSDs. Okay, so on top of this is the finalization of the videos. Okay, so this included checking the video and audio works and nothing was wrong with the videos. Some files refused to finalize and I needed to get to the bottom of why. So lots of troubleshooting the exact reason of the failure. And 3, if there's ultimately no problem, I had to catalog the videos accordingly for upload and usage purposes. So I'm giving you such extensive detail to highlight the fact of why I was locked out of actually just simply continuing the writing. Therefore, as far as dealing with the VOD apocalypse during that time was this constant 5-minute on, 5-minute off type of deal, where I had to actively repeat on the process, everything I just said, that process I mentioned again and again, which was highly disruptive to my creative output. Additionally, as an additional element to this, I refuse to let go of the philosophical wrestling I was engaged with in Being in Time. In other words, these 2 to 3 weeks in March were purely dedicated in tackling Heidegger's philosophy. You might be surprised to hear this, even though I highlighted my lack earlier. For all my efforts, I was progressing at a rate of 5 to 10 pages a day. So, in being hit with the Vought apocalypse, I realized I had foundationally misunderstood something about Heidegger, forcing me to reread the past 150 pages of progress I've made as I dealt with the systemizing of getting these videos localized on my hard drives. This is, of course, a blow to my confidence, as it felt quite embarrassing to be making the amount of philosophical progress I was actually making as before. I was already never satisfied with the speed I was working on this project. To be clear, this is not to signal some form of like defeat or how I had a major depression or something, but it signals a highly stressful and anxiety-filled March that was exceedingly unfun. So it stemmed additionally from the direct annoyance that was actually getting really close, before the Vought apocalypse hit, really close to finishing the goal of making videos of 6.4 and 6.5, and I was actually going to finish all the videos on the job quests, which got inevitably furlonged by an entire month. In the midst of the trial that life had thrown like me, philosophically, there was a metamorphosis. There was a foundational breakdown, as in my epistemological and ontological core in my approach to philosophy. Here, to explain simply, meant the realization I was reading all these philosophers and philosophies, and those you see in the back, propositionally, in this tacit modern Western-centric education system of, oh, I'm going to memorize these propositions, all these ideas are interesting, blah, blah, blah. So when, in fact, this was in my opinion, antithesis to the famous existentialist motto, existence precedes essence. Thus, transformed, not even at the end of Being in Time yet, I ultimately caved on a point that I was sitting on for a while. This is George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's Phenomenology of a Spirit. In my naive earlier spirit, similar in my avoidance of Heidegger, Hegel is a monumental figure in philosophical history. The reason, of course, of why you don't hear about him, because he is the very figure of an ivory tower philosopher, to which you will get no simple self-help prescriptions from him. He is obviously infamous for the density of his philosophical language he uses. So what you will usually see from Hegel is sort of this inherent mockery that Hegel was just being convoluted for the sake of being convoluted. Like he was this con man, a philosophical con man, which isn't quite true in any capacity. So the earlier choice to avoid him is made up of those two foolish reasons of A, seemingly no prescriptive power, and B, an enormous philosophical obstacle that I went around. In preference to reading Stanford's Wikipedia, the Stanford encyclopedia entry on him, and watching videos designed for beginners on Hegel. However, in tackling Being in Time, Hegel's mark on existentialist thinkers is now unmistakable, as Sartre and de Beauvoir have both dedicated lengthy sections to this thinker. Yet, in realizing my profound lack of historical knowledge of philosophy, the other name that was constantly being summoned in the philosophy book was the poster boy of Enlightenment philosophy, namely Immanuel Kant. Okay, in philosophy then, it is no secret the phenomenology of the spirit can be seen as a major response to Kant. However, almost all the philosophers I have read are post-Kantians. In other words, not only do they criticize him, but to deconstruct and rebuild his ideas. Now, to receive information secondhand via the likes of Sartre and Heidegger, for example, about Kant, is not really endemic to knowing what the original philosopher said. In this case, two things aligned in me biting the bullet, knowing what the biting the bullet and reading two non-existentialists philosophers in the role, by which I understood the amount of time away from existentialism was necessary, that this was a necessary process, which was an enormous investment to begin first with the critique of pure reason and later the phenomenology of spirit. First, understanding how Kant transformed the landscape of in continental philosophy during the Enlightenment, and the move into his philosophy, and out of his philosophy, and how that shaped existentialist thinking and the philosophy landscape after him. Second, the critique of pure reason, which had some surprising insights, served as one of the primary keystones to unlock not only the phenomenology, but also other existentialist works like Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness. In working through Kant's primary text, I did manage to defeat the Twitch apocalypse. I did bring salvation to all my videos, which amounted to somewhere around 10 terabytes of data stored. So in this case, in the video sense, I've only re-uploaded what I deemed important to the project. So I apologize if you were waiting for a specific playthrough you wanted to see. And of course, if you want to see a specific playthrough, please let me know. In terms of writing, this was around April to July. The work was around completing the rewrite of 5.1 to 5.3. There's a deep sense of irony here, as I initially attempted to dodge the topic of history and legacy in the original writing. I won't get more into this now. However, the point here is that being in time and being in nothingness both had criticisms of Hegel's idea of history in the existential sense. So when I came to on the writing again, I realized that this dodging I was doing was not good enough. So the core heart of the writing needed to be transformed and be reorientated towards a new thesis. And this was the discussion on history and legacy. There is, of course, a further irony here, as I had not actually started on the phenomenology of spirit, i.e., I had no idea what Hegel actually meant by history, even though I was tangentially talking about him. It should be noted this took quite a while, sort of just moving into the post patches in Shadowbringers. Yeah. Okay, so the total rewrite with some of my original existing ideas, this included the flow of the rhetoric from out of patch 5.0. And additionally, whereas before I did not finish all of Shadowbringer's job quests, however, now I have during this time. So this added a new dimension to strengthen the overall argument. Mechanically, all the major groundwork in terms of footage are largely completed. Barring any scenes I need to re-record, and this included in editing that footage and uploading the video. Immediately, all the job quests up to Endwalker has been completed. Endwalker, including all of its post-patch stories, are all also completed. All tangential quests that relate to the theme of existentialism. This includes the Margaret custom delivery grind, Tataru's Grand Endeavor, which, by the way, was surprisingly really long, and a Heartless Hypothesis, and all the Hildebrand quests for the entire Heidelin Zodiac saga. Looking back on it, I think the only reason I did the Hildebrand stuff was because there was like 16 hours of unedited content on the computer, and I just decided to finish the quest lines so I can export this as a proper video as opposed to just like it rotting on the hard drive, where I think I will eventually just forget about them. The one that is unmentioned in the above list I just provided is the Borgia storyline. There was a bit of fear of this doing this one, as I had never done content concerning relic weapon grinding. And as much as a Dauntra relic grind was coming out, there was a fear that the players doing Borgia would dry up. In this case, I did manage to finish the storyline, overcoming the grind necessary to progress the narrative. Okay, so philosophically, Kant's major work, The Critique of Pure Reason, was successfully finished. This took around 2 months while I was constantly listening to Hubert Dreyfus's lecture on Heidegger's Being and Time. There's about like 40 to 50 hours of this online. This is just to give you an idea that I was studying Heidegger at the same time leading up to the Phenomenology of Spirit. I decided to get it like an introduction to the Phenomenology, which is Kozyrev's introduction, which in hindsight was a hilarious decision, as Kozyrev is let's just say he's a very dogmatic interpreter of Hegel, which as of now, I'm not sure whether reading this actually helped me or not in preparing for the Phenomenology of Spirit. I suspected that when I actually started the Phenomenology of Spirit, after being thoroughly embarrassed by my inability to understand Heidegger, the going through Hegel's philosophy was arduously slow, as expected, yet I am proud to say, despite the caricature of Hegel being incomprehensible or being purposely convoluted, that through a lot of careful navigation, that Hegel does not read at all what certain places of the internet that like to dismiss him due to his writing style, which is really just the way he thought. Simply speaking, I understand how he argued his points and what the points he was actually trying to make. Also, during this time, I was getting really exhausted from reading one hard philosopher at a time. I took up many of the philosophers' recommendations online of trying to read different books at the time. In this sense, the books I read in between squinting over the lines of Hegel's philosophy were two by Nietzsche, which is Beyond Good and Evil and The Gay Science, and Camus, one of Camus' final works, which was The Plague. So as we move into August 2025 to the time that this video will be releasing, the journey plays out like this. So first, a major obstacle. So the move with the writing that bridges the end of Shadowbringers Epic in patch 5.3 to patch 5.4 was done via the Soul of Warlit storyline about Gaius van Belzar, or as everyone likes to call it, FF14's Gundam storyline. Okay. As always, while the spirit of the original writing was kept, certain sections were massively bulked up to ensure the flow of the rhetoric remained consistent. This took much longer than I anticipated, although I always find myself saying that with everything I do. This was due to a comparative analysis of capitalistic conception of modern meritocratic ideals versus the tyrannical conception of meritocratic ideals that we see in the game. Additionally, although almost every story dealing with power likes to quote Dalbert Acton's infamous line of absolute power corrupts absolutely, and most like to tacitly infer what he meant as automatically understood, very few actually understood why Dalbert Acton wrote this line that will be quoted for the rest of history. This section took about a month. What's surprising about it stems from the fact the spirit of the writing took on a political character, and that specific framing changed the nature by which the analysis of this tragic storyline took place. This section was interesting to work on, as the nature of the work turned out to be something a bit different from what I was expecting, but nonetheless, what felt like a rewarding experience. Okay, so as we transition then to 5.4, the writing here was massively reworked, while retaining the original thesis. In comparison to the other section I reworked in Shadowbringers, this rewrite had a specific difficulty to it. You will note that I constantly reference tracking the movement of my argument and rhetoric throughout the Highland Zodiac epic, or to put it simply, I needed to make sure I don't contradict myself and remember what exactly I was trying to say through these narrative analyses. And nowhere was that more important than leading up to the dreaded Endwalker writing, as patch 5.4 and patch 5.5 highlighted the culmination and final setup before we enter Endwalker's existentialist storyline. Not only did these final post-Shadowbringers patches frame the entire FF14 story up to now, they were also attempting to finish many of the plot threads throughout the entirety of this epic. In this case, you can see how important it is to keep track of my arguments all the way from patch 1.0 to the end of patch 5.55. Because the key thing here is if I were to compare my knowledge of the lore and story in the initial Shadowbringer analysis, where I was just this lowly newbie sprout, versus what I know about FF14 now, it is a night and day difference. Okay. Furthermore, to give the final boost to the fact that I wanted to know everything I could know about the game, I went through all 3 available Eorzea encyclopedias, which including purchasing this last one that you see here. It was a deeply important element in detailing and tracing the story of Garlemald in the game. Okay. And to this fact, I did dedicate a long section of the entire epic from the perspective of Garlemald. This turned out surprisingly to be the most lore-intensive section of the work so far, as multiple non-MSQ storylines needed to be tracked down and analyzed. This is the whole thing with Borgia. Obscure lore pieces like the sightseeing log that you see here, and the Borgia field notes needed to be tracked down and obtained, as these are pieces of loot, so to speak, rare loot that you needed to get, and as well as all pieces of lore pertaining to this topic from not only within the game and of course outside the game. So I definitely felt like a nerd historian during the month of September concerning Final Fantasy XIV. On the mechanical side, and this was somewhat surprising, I was actually out of stuff to do. In terms of content to record and storylines in FF14 to edit into videos, there is, to my knowledge, none left that has to do with my writing. As of now, I think sometime around September, I actually ran out of plot-related content to do, and predominantly became this Borgia relic grind goblin. Insofar as this topic is concerned, 3 final tangential pieces of lore-related content still remains to be done, which kind of puts me in an awkward situation. One is the Eureka relic grind content, or simply the lore behind the students of Baldesion concerning the story of Cryo Baldesion. The other 2 is every single piece of sightseeing log from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker. This is a hole in the information that I needed to patch up. And 2, every yellow side quest from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker, to which would serve as a fantastic filler footage where when I find myself simply repeating footage from the MSQ over and over and over and over again while I blather on for hours. Also, in this vein, there is little hope that there's a little hope in me that some of these yellow side quests would have content in relation to the arguments that I'm trying to make in my video analysis essay. In terms of philosophy for the 3 months leading up to October 2025 is, of course, the titanic struggle with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, of the fact that it never seems good enough to read a sentence once or twice, but to do it again and again. Insofar, by the end of the book, I felt like I read the phenomenology 5 times front to back. And this was a very rewarding experience in the sense that for those more philosophically minded, I was going through the history of philosophical ideas backwards. Some of you might also find this funny. Therefore, understanding Hegel and not just what Sartre or Heidegger said about him filled up a massive philosophical hole about what is meant by the phenomenology before Edmund Husserl took over that nomination completely. After which, to buffer this understanding, and just not to pretend that I arrogantly understood Hegel perfectly, I listened to Slavoj Žižek's lecture on Hegel. Hilariously enough, as Žižek was very entertaining to listen to, as this man cannot stay on topic for the life of him. I probably learned more about Zizek than about Hegel. Additionally, what was more interesting, given that Zizek is an eccentric thinker, he highlighted a massive chunk of the modern discourse of philosophy compared to the historical investigation I was doing on what inspired the existentialists. As one of the things listening to Zizek has truly done was to highlight the modern tension surrounding Hegel's philosophy and unlocked facets of postmodernist thought, which I never seriously dealt with before due to my field of study. In this case, this nicely opened the way up to one of the books that Dr. Vervaeke highlighted during his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. The key here is that Vervaeke, as he was ending his lectures on the topic of the meaning crisis, signposted several neo-Heideggerian thinkers, one of these being Paul Tillich, to which Vervaeke endorses as a neo-Heideggerian, as a scholar versed in theological methods of thinking. As Tillich presented the Western religious side, Vervaeke signposted an Eastern religious thinker in this regard, namely Keiji Nishitani. What's interesting then is that, well, Vervaeke brings up the name in the book, admits that he's still slogging through it, but provides the reference for those interested in the cross-cultural examination on the problem of the meaning crisis. Of course, this greatly piqued my interest, and you can also see why I bit the bullet on completing the Phenomenology of Spirit, as this related to religion and nothingness as well. As of now, having just begun on Nishitani's most famous work to the West, I can confirm this book is difficult. To preface, I think every philosopher is difficult in their own way, whether they challenge the normal framework you think about things, or they have complex structure analysis that you need to work through several times before grasping the key argument. Nishitani's thought has its own elements of difficulty, insofar as the introduction by the translator and Nishitani's own preface, it is fundamentally clear if one has no grasp of the major continental philosophers and have at least engaged with, have at least a minimal engagement with Eastern philosophy, one will be totally lost. In this case, it reminded me of reading Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy, to which she will not stop to give a detailed description to the ideas she references. She immediately expects you to know them. Like in The Ethics of Ambiguity, she expects you to know Husserl and Hegel's philosophy completely, unlike her lifelong partner, Sartre, who liked to give elaborately long descriptions. De Beauvoir's thinking is quick-witted, sharp insights, and enjoys in the actual engagement with the real prescriptive power and commentaries on culture and societal events. As far as Nishitani is concerned, it was fairly clear I had barely scratched the surface of Eastern philosophy, as there were many Eastern ideas brought up that I did not know about. It was nice, though, when most of the Western philosophy that was brought up, I knew, so that was nice. But certainly, this will be a great challenge, I suspect. I do always find myself getting excited to step off the continental side of philosophy, which I usually find myself entrenched in, and going to Eastern ideas. I don't know quite why this is. So this culminates to all the work I have been doing over the past year. As such, two things bear mentioning tangentially. Okay. So most of the entertainment I consume off stream now are existential narratives, as this will present the bulk of the content in Endwalker, as I had been carefully documenting anything from manga like this, novels, TV shows, anime, and film that contains the philosophical theme and ideas that are represented in the philosophy that I am studying. I can't really imagine, once I get to Endwalker, just replaying Endwalker cutscenes over and over and over and over again. So I believe these additional footage will be necessary. Of course, in reference to this, I have many ideas for the videos I am making during this entire process of learning and practicing what I'm trying to do. By the end of this, to portray a sentiment of absurdity, when I finally decide to move forward with the Endwalker section, the cataloging and organization of these ideas might take up to 1 to 2 months. Okay, now we finished Shadowbringers writing. Where do I go from here? I think realistically, if I was being honest with myself, the official process of starting to work on Endwalker would take place during the second half of 2026. That is to say, I always underestimate the necessary amount of time to do the things that I want to do. So immediately, I will either dedicate my full time into studying Nishitani's philosophy, or make one of the core parts of the Shadowbringer series that can be taken out of the context of FF14's analysis. This will be a video, as hinted at during the previous update, about the concept of narration in video game storytelling. When I say first person or third person, people will who play video games will automatically think of a game mode of like how you literally look through the video game world. That is not what I mean. I mean how narration is used in storytelling, and in this case, in video game stories. Okay. The problem now is getting into the groove of video making. I think what's a little annoying and a bit interesting is the cycles of how I have to start something and stop doing something, like starting to write analysis and then stopping. And it always feels like around the second half is when I get used to the process of doing something. The struggle is getting the ball rolling. I need the initial momentum to continue the motion of the process. Therefore, I think realistically, the first thing I'm going to do is to start to consume video making and video editing content as well. I enjoyed making the previous video on how YA narratives deals with themes of power. That felt like me picking up a pencil and just sort of like scribbling on a piece of paper with like no real idea of how drawing actually works. Of course, one always curses one's own inadequacy, and I'm not expecting to become some sort of master video editor, but it would be nice to get some basics, what stuff to avoid doing and some ideas to move forward when using a video format medium to engage an audience on a subject. After which, if I do finish that video at the beginning of the year, I will dedicate full time to studying philosophy. So, in terms of studying philosophy, this is a frustrating topic for me, as it concerns the idea of progress of this project, as there is this nagging feeling within me that this is me over intellectualizing things and evading the responsibility of actually releasing the videos that I want to make. Like, the crazy thing is that from Around Reborn to Shadowbringers, these analyses, they actually barely have anything barely to do with philosophy. Like, those sections have like literally nothing to do with philosophy. However, I am just unsatisfied. Perhaps I will never be satisfied with several voids of information that other existentialist thinkers have signposted. I should, essentially, finish the major existentialist work, the second sex and the phenomenology of perception. I should and understand one of the genesis of the meaning crisis and existential ideas brought forward by the proto-existentialist Dostoevsky. I should understand the other major schools of thought in Eastern philosophy in relation to the idea of existential phenomenon, which refers to the inevitable in Taoism. And just to be clear, I have not read all of these books that you see here. And all these works that I hear about again and again in my crusade to plunder existentialist knowledge. Insofar as this absurd goal that I've set for myself is less on intellectual arrogance, but recognizing the intersections of existentialist thinking across all cultures and philosophies. This is not to say they are the same. No, that would be foolish. But to build a framework of the existential story that I want to tell with the series on Endwalker. In this sense, one other video will probably be made during this time as the official start to the Endwalker section, which is the narrative analysis on the symbol of the bluebird. I will either make this during the massive study section or after the studying is done. Of course, as soon as Endwalker's writing begins, because this is from scratch and out of nothing compared to the rewrites of the previous sections, we need to, once again, do the accursed timestamps. As this will serve as a review, and also the reformatting for the old timestamps that was made was terrible. Immediately after this will be the massive organizational and brainstorming and planning that will occur on how I would proceed. In as much it has become clear, perhaps even one 12-hour video would not be enough to contain the content I want to make. Maybe I will make it a philosophy by philosophy. This is, this part of the work is still sort of an unknown to me, even with all my cute little ideas that I want to try out. So we shall see on that front. Okay. And this section, I didn't really write. And yeah, so that details all the work I've done up till this point and all the work that will be happening moving forward, despite whatever contingent future situations that will happen to me that I might need to adapt to. So yeah. This is all to say that if you have stuck around during all this time, while I'm just on the screen studying, writing, and practically just streaming my progress of this ridiculous project that I'm on. I really want to thank you, and I deeply appreciate people that just drop by and say hello, and that means a lot to me. So yeah, that is it. Going to be it for this update. See you next time.